from the many participants in person that are already here or that will join us through the day, I would only like to pick out our keynote speaker, Dr. Eva Anagnostou-Laoutides, because she has really had the longest way. She's joining us from Australia, and thank you so much for coming all the way here. I will introduce you later in more detail. Then I would also like to thank in particular Dr. Jean Kurt and Ms. Leonie Weber, because they are joining us in person from the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany. And all of the speakers will be introduced somewhat more detail through the day. Well, this is a special day for me, for many in this room, because it's the first event of the Waterloo Institute for Hellenistic Studies after 3 years. And I can already announce there will be many more events. Please check out the website. In a couple of days, we will actually put on a program of many other events for this year. It is also a first in its cooperation of classical studies and the Waterloo Institute for Hellenistic Studies with the Dragen Lab, which normally focuses on medieval studies, but does so much more, reaching out in all historical and archaeological disciplines. And I'm really indebted to its director, Dr. Steve Bednarski, for inviting us so generously into his castle, I would say. And he cannot be with us. He is lecturing today in England. So he is meant to be represented by the associate director, David Poreka, who will be with us later today. But I do want to mention in person, she's not in this room, but in another, Miss Shannon Blackmore, who I'm the manager of the Dragen Lab, who has been so helpful. Then this is also another first off. It's the first off cooperation also with the new student-run journal for creative writing, Epic Threads. And we have the two editors with us. The one of them is Miss Madeline Parrish, whom I've mentioned before, and the other is Miss Mary Harper, sitting there and being one of our panelists tonight. So I think this is really a time to congratulate you for the great work you have done, and we wish Epic Threads a great future. So this is not the first big event with classical studies at UW, and here I'd like to single out Miss Bridget Schnebeli. She's also in the rear. She has helped us a lot setting up everything. And then I would like to thank my chair, Dr. Andrew Faulkner, for all the support he has been giving this event. So Andrew, you may have a few words.
Thank you, Altay. So I'm Andrew Faulkner, and as chair of the Department of Classical Studies, I'd like to welcome everyone, both online, internationally, especially those guests who've traveled so far to be here with us, and of course all of our students to this international research event. I always reflect that so much of the work that we do as scholars is behind closed doors and often in silence. And these moments when we can come together and share what we've been working on and collaborate, I think are always very special moments. A particular thank you, of course, to Altay for organizing this event. I think it's going to be a really wonderful event over the course of really what has been a weekend and beginning of a week for those people who traveled so far. Altay has already mentioned the many collaborations that have gone into this event, and so I'd also like to thank Dr. Stephen Bednarski and the Dragen Lab, and also all of our colleagues in the Waterloo Institute of Hellenistic Studies for supporting this event. So welcome. I hope this is a productive and fruitful event, and I look forward to talking to you all more as we move on. Thanks, Altay.
Thank you, Andrew. So before we start with the regular papers, I'd like to share a few more thoughts on female roles, foundation legends, and storytelling. These are three different topics, but which may overlap in quite interesting ways, as we are going to see today. And they seem to resonate also with a very general audience, not just a research audience. So it's good to reflect a little bit on some of the scholarly backgrounds. First of all, when we ask ourselves how to read foundation legends, how to read ancient texts in general, it's very important to emphasize that there are diverse readings, and it's valuable that there is a diversity of approaches, and that shall always be the case. But at the same time, it's valuable for us to reflect on which approaches we choose and why, and what we may gain from also choosing alternative approaches and measuring our methods with those of others. So there is, when it comes to storytelling and legends, of course, a very general popular approach, that of edutainment. Edutainment includes, well, storytelling, good night stories to children told at the bedside, as much as going to the movies or to a theater. There is always a factor of entertainment, and there is always a factor of education involved. And typically, these approaches are somewhat naive in that they tend to take traditional narratives literally. And in contrast, academic approaches tend to look for symbolic meanings in narratives, especially in foundation narratives and in myths. There is the general assumption that there are universal patterns of human interaction behind the scenes or integrated into the actions of the heroes and heroines. And in fact, it's Plato who is the first who has developed the theory and has applied the theory of interpreting myths this way. And the Christian church fathers developed it further in certain ways. And in modern times, I think it's the name of Carl Gustav Jung who deserves to be mentioned. So it's permeating classical scholarship and literary studies more broadly. When it comes to foundation stories, the point of reference nowadays tends to be Jane Doherty's The Poetics of Colonization, which tries to find analyze narrative patterns of foundation to look for symbolism that legitimates or explains in a legitimating way the settlements of Greeks. And of course, there may be some criticism that the traditional approach of classical scholarship has been quite Hellenocentric and focused only on Greek perspectives. However, for now, I would say some 25, 30 years, we see that post-colonial studies are also permeating classical studies. For me personally, I was approached to it by the works of Greg Wolfe, especially his works on Greek and Romans and the cultural interactions between Greek and Rome. When it comes to colonial settlements, one name for colonial settlements in Gaul that is important for my personal studies is that of Michael Dietler, Archaeologies of Colonialism. So we'll hear a little bit more about him in my lecture. I refer to the important work of Eric Gruen with his Rethinking the Other, which really sets in motion many other publications. I've learned a lot from the work of Nisha McSweeney. Her Foundation Myths in Politics, published in 2013, has really given me many, many ideas of how I would like to develop this larger project on ethnic identity, colonial encounter, and storytelling. The value of her work is to elaborate on the one hand the Athenian turn, how Athenian conflicts with the Persians, Athenian imperialism in the 5th century has gradually changed the view that ancient Greeks took on non-Greeks very broadly, and a very lasting imprint there was indeed. However, at the same time, she has shown that not everyone just followed blindly the Athenian way, but very often there was an engagement with the Athenian view and many subversive notes that must not be overlooked. I have benefited a lot from the works of my friend Marta Oyer Guzman, where she focuses in her work on the emotions of both the Greeks and the locals. And I was very much touched by her argument that many archaic foundation legends emphasize initial friendship relations between settlers and newcomers. So there is a high potential in exploring this further. She will be one of our speakers this morning. my personal inclination in classical scholarship and also in this context is to be analytical in the sense of textual and narrative analysis, in the sense of identifying different text layers, different time layers, and different ideological layers in text and in narratives. So you will find, you will see an illustration of that method also later in my talk. Of course, I should say a little bit about female roles as well. I keep it short for now, but one of the main controversial issues in the studies of female roles in ancient literature is the question how much agency of women in the ancient world do we see represented in these texts, and also visual representations, of course, and how much symbolic representation do we have. So what do we actually learn about the lives of women in ancient texts? So that's quite a controversial topic. And at this point, I just want to say that when scholars, as I often do, deny that a certain text actually tells us about a woman in the time that the text alleges to do, such as a foundation story that was already a foundation that happened centuries before the story was first told. So when I say we do not actually learn anything about what women did at the time, but we rather learn something about how people thought about women at the time that the story was told, this does not mean that I deny that women had agency in foundations themselves. It is just methodologically important to emphasize that it's much more difficult for us to understand what they did historically. This distinction is very important to me. And yet, the concentration of most papers today will actually be on the literary representation of women. So this will be important to know. One thing for me is left to do. It's the territorial acknowledgement, which has become customary in Canadian institutions. So I would like to acknowledge the following. The University of Waterloo recognizes that much of its work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The main campus is located on the Haldimand Tract, which is the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. This acknowledgement is an important step towards reconciliation and reflects the university's commitment to understanding and respecting the history and contributions of Indigenous peoples. Now, some find it very important on Canada's path towards truth and reconciliation with First Nations to read out such acknowledgements. Others are very indifferent, and yet others regard it as lip service, and there are some that find these acknowledgements very misleading. And I do think it's very important that there's also open debate about the legitimacy, the quality, and the effect of such territorial acknowledgements. For me personally, and for the event that we are hosting today, I think it is very fitting and pertinent to remember that most people have been migrants before becoming settlers anywhere, whether people themselves or their ancestors. So remembering that comes with actually complex duties to care for the land, the people on it, and their traditions, and also to remember one's own roots. And so when going forward and trying to build a future for us all.